Greetings, Preston McKee here with our last seminar Saturdays for fall 2025. And this week's topic is on swing states and the tax breaks those swing states are receiving. The paper is called Tax Breaks for Swing States, Political Bargaining, Targeted Policies, and Firm Outcomes by Sahil, Raina, and Sheng-Jun. I apologize if I mangled one of those names. And this is a paper presented at WFA, so it's a working paper, and managed to have a nice sort of rhyming initial title. We don't always have fun titles like that in papers. Okay, so the way this paper works requires us to talk a little bit about U.S. politics because it's based on U.S. The effect of U.S. politics on companies. So in the United States, U.S. legislatures are selected by geographic locations, or from a geographic location, either a entire state or a district within the state. If it's a one House member in that single state, because it's a very small state, then it's just a subset that is equal to the state. Now, there are political reasons why you would want to do this. It does ensure representation for all parts of the country, so there's someone who is directly responsible or responsive, perhaps, to that particular part of the country. And there's a natural expectation built in to at least when the US system was created, and any system that has this kind of location-based representation, that the individual legislature from that particular region of the country is going to be advocating for their own regions because their voters that they are beholden to are going to care about their personal situation, not the country writ large, which has advantages and also disadvantages. We're not going to get into that. The question the paper is looking at is if we have a shift in the political power such that the power of these individual legislatures has increased or decreased, does that result in real effects for businesses and the local economy that are located in that legislature's district? And then what form do these political advantages or disadvantages take? Because there's a lot of different ways that the federal government could spend money or not spend money in these areas, and it's interesting to see how they're going to actually direct more money to this place if they're doing that. Okay, so first we need to talk about the theory behind how there's going to be a change in political power, and the author's logic is something like this. So you have a legislature, let's say it's the US Senate, because that's what they focus on in the paper, and the political power of individual members is going to be affected by the margin that the majority has to pass legislation. So you can have a Senate where it's 56 members that are in the majority party when you need 50 to pass, or you can have 51. So if you have a narrow majority, say you only have 51 votes in your 51 senators in the majority party, that majority can't afford to lose very many votes. It can afford to lose one senator, it can't lose two. And in that case, if a senator is from a swing state and is therefore probably more moderate, that person has a lot of influence because the majority party can't afford to lose that swing state member. Meanwhile, if you have a large majority, say it's 56 seats out of 100, you can afford to lose 6 votes. So you can ignore a couple moderate swing state senators and their desires, their demands that you need to bargain with in order to get their vote, their support for a legislation is irrelevant. You can just ignore them. You don't need their support. So this logic for the swing states applies both for members of your own party as well as swing state members of the minority parties, because those guys also are probably moderates, closer to your party's positions on whatever legislation we're looking at. And so their votes are more gettable. And if you get one of their votes and you have a narrow majority, that gives you a lot of extra breathing room to lose a member from your own party. Right? So let's say you have 52, 51 senators in your majority party. You're able to get two swing state members from the minority party to vote for this piece of legislation. Well, that's two extra votes that you can now afford to lose from your own party. Meanwhile, if you're at 56, the moderate members of the minority party, you don't really care about them. Their vote doesn't really give you much of an extra cushion because you already have such a huge cushion. The authors focus only on swing states, as the title of the paper would suggest. I kind of putting on my referee hat right now. I think the logic that they're using would apply to the most extreme members of the majority party too, because you can think of political parties, particularly we're talking about the U.S., where parties are very large and broad coalitions. There's people that are in the center of the party. There's the moderates who are on the left or right end of the party, depending on which party we're talking about. And there's also extreme members who are on kind of the opposite end of those moderate senators. So if you have a 56 majority, there might be a couple of extreme far right or far left type senators relative to your party. You can lose their votes. So you can say, well, Senator whoever, we don't need your support, so we don't need to give you concessions in this legislation in order to pass legislation. So you can vote against it, fine. You're voting against it for very different reasons than the minority party is probably voting against it, but we can afford to lose your vote. But if you're down to 51 votes out of the 50 you need, you can't afford to lose those far right, far left type people as well, just like the moderate swing states. And I think there's a very nice example of how this sort of worked over the past couple of years. Republicans had a very small majority in the House, and it was such a small majority that a handful, it was like 4 or 5 people that were on the right wing of the Republican Party were able to exert a lot of influence. They caused the sitting Speaker of the House to lose his job because they didn't like what he was doing, and that he was kind of being too moderate. Like they had a lot of power because they controlled enough votes that without them, the Republicans didn't have a majority. But if the Republican majority was like 20 seats, those 5 people on the far right would not have been able to have much influence because the Republican majority could just ignore them when it came to many of these leadership and other types of votes. So I think, and I don't know if the authors tried this and just didn't find anything. That's always that sort of problem is just rampant in any sort of scientific field. But I think it'd be good to see, like, hey, do states that were like super lopsided, do those states start receiving extra benefits when the margin is very small, right? So you're a senator from a state and it's like you won, the president won that state by by 50 points. It was a complete blowout, 70-20 kind of massive victory, which there aren't very many states that are that lopsided. Even California isn't that lopsided, I don't think. And do the senators from that state, are they able to bring home more bacon for their home state when things are really tight, and are they less able to do it when things are there's a large majority? So I probably spent too much time on this, but referees like doing that sort of thing. Anyways, let's move on to the empirical setting. So the problem with looking at just looking at the Senate margin for the majority party or the margin in the House is that, as everyone kind of knows, elections are influenced by local economic conditions. And so your political advantage or disadvantage for the majority party is not random. It's determined by economic conditions. Like those matter a lot for elections. However, the Senate is a little bit different in that there's only one third of the senators are up for re-election every 2 years. So there's the majority of the Senate was decided in an election 2 years ago or 4 years ago, one third each. And so that means you could have an election which shifts the margin majority party into a narrow majority. But most of the senators didn't actually have to win an election under the current economic conditions. So the authors use an example. They don't actually use this example that much, although it is a very, very nice example, which is the 2021 January Georgia runoff elections. Both incumbent senators were Republicans. They both lost very close races, and that shifted the Senate from being 52-48 Republican majority to a 50-50 tie, which is the closest possible margin for the majority party, and the Democrats became the majority party because they had the vice president to break ties. And in that case, just like with a 51-49, the majority can't afford to lose even a single vote, which means a swing state senator has a huge amount of power. As if people are paying attention to things going on in the Senate, like someone like Joe Manchin, who's definitely, he's not really from a swing state, but he's definitely a moderate part of their Democrat caucus. He had a lot of power because if they lost his vote, they didn't have a majority anymore. But the idea is here that if you're a non-Georgia swing state senator, you had an increase of power because the margin for the majority party got a lot smaller. It shrunk from 52 down to 50. So you could lose, instead of being able to lose 2 votes, now you can't lose any votes. So those senators saw an increase in political power, but they didn't participate in the election that changed their power. They had won an election in the past, which means that they were currently in office. But so that's the idea. Now, authors focus mostly just on broadly looking at swing states. Whenever the Senate is balanced, they define it as saying the majority has at most a 53-47 margin. So you can lose 3 votes and you're still at 50-50. This is the median for their sample. That's the reason they chose that. I mean, there's not a huge amount of data that they can use, so I'm not sure how much variation there is in this sort of margin. I am kind of curious, like what would have happened if they said it's 52-48? They have a bunch of robustness checks that tests that I'm not going to go into too much detail on. Maybe they did it there. You would think the effect would be stronger and stronger as you get closer to like a 50-50 tie. Okay. Now, because the Senate has these staggered elections, close races in swing states don't necessarily determine if the Senate's balanced or not. As in like 2021, those were 2 close races. The Senate would have been balanced anyways. 52-48 was considered a close, a balanced Senate, that has a narrow majority. And 50-50 is also. So like there's no outcome of those runoff elections that wouldn't result in a narrow majority. It's just how narrow the majority is. Oh, and in case you didn't know, the reason that there were these runoff elections, Georgia does an unusual system where they run the general election like everyone else in November. If no one has a over 50% majority of the vote, they take the 2 top vote getters and they have them run again in January. And they go head to head, and all the 3rd place and down just get tossed. There's a lot of flexibility for individual states to choose different systems like that. All right, so in terms of their data, their state level vote margins, so they know if it's a close election or not, is from MIT Election Lab. They get the Senate balance for majority party votes versus minority party seats from the U.S. Senate website. I actually have used that exact thing too for a very different type of paper involving federal judges. But yeah, so I've actually used that database. They have a bunch of different sources for state level federal spending because they need to know like how much money the federal government is spending on inside individual states. So usaspending.gov seems to have like a very comprehensive database for them, and to expand their time frame so they have more years in going back, they also use U.S. National Archives and Records Administration and U.S. Federal Procurement Data System. I have no experience with any of those databases. They have state level economic measures like GDP, employment, etc., for controls and for outcomes. This is again government data, quarterly census of employment and wages, and Bureau of Economic Analysis. Federal government provides this too. There's this subsidy tracker of Good Jobs First. It's a private database, it looks like, and they match that to CompuStat, and that tells them about like benefits that are being provided to individual firms. Usually firms aren't singled out directly, but maybe you have a tax break for a specific industry, so every firm in that industry would benefit. And then they have stock returns, the very standard sources here, CRISP, which everyone uses, and risk factors from the Ken French website, which again, everyone uses that too. So the first thing to look at is spending on those swing states. So they have you're a swing state, and this is based on the presidential election, the margin of victory. And you're a balanced Senate. So it's you were a swing state in the last presidential election, and the Senate is currently balanced for this year. And what they find is that, yes, total spending from the federal government in that state increases. And somewhat interestingly, I think there's probably an interesting political science type thing you could do here is it's not because the federal government is doing more contracts with federal contractors or whatever in that state. They're not shifting grants to these swing states, but they are offering more loans and just direct payments to people and entities in that state is going up. It's quite strong statistically for just the payments. So it seems like government procurement and grants are not how you're directing the money to your swing state and not how you're bringing home the bacon as a home state senator. It's instead through government offering more loans to people in your state, offering more payments to people and institutions in your state. They also can look at individual firms. These are, to be clear, publicly traded companies because they're being matched to CompuStat. So these are all generally pretty big companies. And it appears that it is only coming through tax credits. So property tax, nope. Grants, which again, we were not seeing any grants here. Good confirmation that we're not seeing grants here either. And this is both the entire sample of firms as well as the sample of firms that ever have received some sort of subsidy at some point. So tax credits are being given to firms that are disproportionately in these swing states. Again, if you benefit a single industry, well, some industries are more predominant in individual states than not. There's, for instance, a lot of cattle industry out here in West Texas, and there's definitely not as much cattle industry around the suburbs of Chicago where I was born and grew up. So you can sort of target industries, and by targeting that industry, you target your home state. So there's federal money flowing in towards the swing states and towards firms headquartered in the swing states, but does it matter? Or does the company do things differently because of this money? For instance, maybe they invest more because they're receiving more cash. Or does the government spending just crowd out their own investments and nothing happens? And also, can we see any changes in the company's operations, their operating performance? Does that improve? Does getting the free money from this guy from the federal government help the companies, or maybe it's bad investments? And traditional economic theory would kind of say this is going to be bad investments because the federal money is coming for political purposes, not because this is the best place to invest. Well, it seems like investment is going up. So valuation of the investments is higher. So their investments are improving. Although Tobin's Q is a very old and often not great measure for valuation of the company, but like their valuation's improving. Okay. They are spending more on capex and R&D, so they're investing more in tangible assets and intangible assets. R&D and capex are both investing, and they seem to be growing in size as their fixed expenses are increasing too. And this is robust to throwing in all sorts of various controls about various things that might have affected political power, because like if your person was a committee chair or something like that. In terms of operating performance, not so impressive for the companies. So profitability, it's negative sign, but no statistical significance. Revenue doesn't as positive sign, but doesn't no significance again. ROA, so this is income per asset. Remember, they're buying a lot of assets, is going down. So I think that is a sign that these investments they're doing are not great investments, which we would, again, traditional economic theory would predict this. They would predict that these investments, because they're being done for political purposes, not for making money purposes, they're going to be suboptimal in terms of making money, which makes sense. Also, they seem to be maybe reducing debt. And the obvious conclusion here is, well, they're receiving additional federal government cash, so they don't need to borrow to do all their investments. They're receiving cash, and so their debt levels go down. Now, what about the overall state of the economy? Not just those individual companies. How does it affect the swing state? So there's a couple different models we can use to sort of think about what the senator is doing by directing federal spending here. It could be that the senator is just trying to improve the economic performance of the home state, and then people's unemployment goes down, wages are increasing, economic growth, and so people are happy and they vote to reelect the person who made them happy. That's the political reason they do it. Alternatively, they might be directing the money not to just sort of benefit the state overall, but to reward their specific supporters. So the politically connected firms that have been donating money to them and lobbying them and stuff, those are the ones who get all this extra cash. And so those individual ones benefit, and maybe there's less benefit for the overall entire economy of the state. Well, the state economy does seem to improve. So you have a positive increase in GDP, in employment. So unemployment's going down, wages are going up. It doesn't seem to change the number of companies, but these are probably the three things that the voters care about more than the number of new companies being started in that state. And so this would make sense with a re-election. We're trying to make people generally happy with the economic performance of their home state. There's appears to be a widespread gain for both large and small firms. It looks stronger for the small firms, which we're going to see more about this in the next slide. It's probably the larger firms that are politically connected, because if you have 20 employees, you're probably not spending money on lobbying. You don't have the resources to do that. If you have hundreds or thousands of employees, maybe you are spending money on lobbying or political contributions, because you have a much larger set of resources available to do that sort of thing. Now, do companies that lobby the Senate or companies that make a lot of political contributions benefit more? And we can go back to the individual companies here, because you can look up the political action committees that are associated with companies, and then you can match those to the companies that they have in terms of those that are based in the state. And well, if you're a swing state, you lobbied the you have lobbyists, so you've been doing lobbying, so you have political connections, and you have a balanced Senate. Tobin's Q is insignificant, but it's negative. CapEx goes down, R&D goes down, your your general size goes down. These are all fairly weak, except for CapEx, but they're in the wrong direction. If we are expecting that the money is going just to the cronies of the senators, instead it seems like these companies are actually hurt by the increase in power. They are, and I wonder if this is sort of a relative advantage thing. Like they already were receiving federal cash because of their lobbying activity, and now companies that didn't have the resources or didn't want to spend the resources to lobby, they're now receiving federal cash because the senator is pushing it to them instead of the companies pulling the cash to them. And so then, because of that relative advantage from political connections versus no political connections has been reduced, since everyone's getting cash now, you see a reduction in the company's performance. If you had made political contributions, and they say Loxen in here, I think this is a typo from an earlier draft of the paper. It probably should say balance Senate. As you can see, they have balanced here and here. But Swing contributed, and so they made contributions to political campaigns, and they balanced Senate. Again, it's negative. Investments going down, firm size is going down, negative, insignificant negative on their Tobin's Q. So it does seem like the increased spending is probably not going to the senator's corporate friends, but rather just everyone in the state. These companies seem to benefit less than the non-politically connected companies. And this is a very crude measure. They're not able to say, well, this company contributed to the swing state senator. They contributed to senators. Because most companies will kind of spread out their cash and like, we'll contribute to this senator and that senator. They contribute to a lot of people. If they're large enough that they're actually going to do that. Same thing with lobbying. Like they don't just lobby a single senator, they'll lobby a whole bunch of them. So you're not able to very precisely say this company has a friendship kind of relationship with that particular swing state senator. It's not that precise. And then they have a huge number of robustness tests. They have a 20-page appendix out of their 100-page paper. This is a very long paper. And they look at things like trade policy, because like you can change trade policy to benefit your state. They look at industry tax incentives, look at changes in regulation. These are all things that senators might be trying to shift to help their home state. I'm not going to go into all those because it's a lot to go through. But it's there. So like this paper has clearly been worked on a lot, and like they've clearly done a ton of robustness checks. So this is a much later stage paper than some of the other papers I've done in this semester that are shorter. I mean, generally the older your paper has gotten, like the more extra stuff you have to shove in, because referees and discussants at conferences have recommended, hey, you should do this thing, like how I recommended that the authors should look at the far right and far left state senators, not just the swing state ones. So, in conclusion, it does seem like there is a shift of federal cash towards states when that home region gains the legislators from that home region gain political power, and there is an economic benefit. Now, again, if you're shifting money to one state, you're shifting money away from another state. So those regions might benefit. Regions that have lost political power presumably would experience a reduction in their economy relative to the ones that are receiving the influx of federal cash. This investment, unsurprisingly, which is what theory would predict, is that seems to be suboptimal in terms of economic potential, and a little surprisingly, perhaps it benefits more the politically unconnected firms and the smaller firms compared to those that are larger and have clear political connections. All right, so we have completed the semester, and we'll be on break until mid-January, when the spring semester starts up. I have a bunch of working papers from WFA that I that I found interesting and have not yet gone through. I'm also going to AFA in January, the very beginning of January, and I'll be seeing a whole bunch of new papers there. So we'll probably have way more papers than I can actually present in a single semester coming up next year. Hope you enjoyed this series. If you did, please comment, like, and or subscribe. We always love to talk about research here in academia. And I'll see you all next semester.